So everything you know about web design has just changed. I think for a lot of folks maybe who've had a career for 5 or so years, there's this feeling that the way we do layout today, or the way that you did layout last year, is just the way it's always been. The methods you use, the frameworks you use, the templates you use, the design tools you use, well, isn't that just how we've done it always and forever? But no, actually, it's not. I think a lot of us, maybe perhaps if you've been in the industry for 10 years, have this idea that, oh yeah, responsive was new at some point. I remember us having to convince people to switch. So there must have been something before responsive design, and then there was responsive design, and we are done. Nothing has changed. Nothing else will change. But the reality is that there has been a long and complicated timeline of different attempts to do page layout and graphic design on the web. We keep trying an idea, deciding we hate it, and switching to a different idea. So why do we keep changing our minds? When I look at it from this point of view, I realize that we've been having a kind of fight with each other in a sandbox, where some of us are sitting on the ground crying, like, meh, and others are standing over going, no, it's going to be like this. Give me the shovel. This is how it has to be. It's been this fight between this reality that we want better graphic design. We want the ability to be able to do something very artistic or to convey a brand clearly, convey ideas around what a story is. But at the same time, we have this medium, which is still, even at 25 years old, still very young. And we are learning what the medium can do. We're defining what the medium is going to be in the near future. And we've realized that we need to go with the web and not pretend that the web is print, or the web is CD-ROMs, or the web is something else, but to actually write code that is the web and of the web. And those two things are sort of this fight. We want to have good, clean code that works on the web, but we want to have really great art. And so we've been trying a bunch of different things to accomplish that desire, to get both at the same time. We've had all these different attempts to solve this desire to do page layout, or component layout, or whatever you want to call it, layout on the web. It all started with simple HTML. Back in the day, at the beginning, there was no CSS, there was no JavaScript. The only thing that you could do is use HTML. And pages laid out like this. Here you can see a headline. It is in an invisible box. So I'm going to mark that box with a purple line so we can kind of see it. And as the window gets bigger, the containing block gets bigger. It just goes and auto-widths itself and just fills up all of the space. We can add a paragraph, and you can see that there is a box around that paragraph. And as it gets narrower, it reflows the content. And as it gets wider and wider, reflows the content. And the height of that box grows and shrinks. We put an image after that paragraph. And then when we make it narrower and that paragraph reflows, the image scoots down all by itself. The paragraph doesn't overlap the image. Everything rejiggers itself to fit, to make the layout work all the time. Except for when the image is too big. That image is overflowing because the containing blocks are too big or the viewport's too big. And so you end up with an overflow problem. I feel like in some ways the whole timeline of layout on the web has been a timeline of struggling with overflow. But you get the idea that this is flow layout. This is how layout works if you do nothing. This is the default layout of the web. It's a little bit like the layout inside a word processing program like Microsoft Word. You don't really have to do a whole lot to move every single thing around. It's flow layout. It's one of the lessons that we have from that era, from that time. And this has been around forever, but we haven't really called it a thing. We haven't given it a name. And I feel like at this point, we are fish who are growing legs, and we're climbing out onto land, and we're having all these conversations about land and what land is and what it means to be on the land. But we also have to give a whole bunch of words and terms to the water, because now water is actually a thing that's different than land. So it helps to have words and learn these words maybe for the first time around what this stuff is, the old stuff. So flow is an important concept. What does it mean to have a flow layout? And these are the kinds of websites that we were able to do using the constraints of the time. Images, we just put the image on the page at the size that it was intrinsically, the size that the image was when it came out of the program that you used to make that image. You could center things, you could change some colors around, but really it was very rudimentary. There were a handful of fonts you could specify. But that was sort of the limitations of the layout. We did, of course, have tables for tabular data in HTML. If you have tabular data today, awesome, use an HTML table. That's what it's for. It makes it easier, especially if you're doing science, which is what the original makers, the inventors of the web were doing. They were doing science. It's a way to put tables of data on the internet. But what happened is graphic designers came along and they said, those cells are really interesting. What if we jam other things in there, things that aren't tabular data, like pictures or sentences? We could start to create layout in a way that's not possible with flow layout. And the era of tables for layout was born. This idea of like, well, we need art. Let's just pursue the ability to have art. It ran from like 1996 to about 2003. I remember even though in 2009 having arguments with PHP engineers where they were advocating that there's nothing wrong with using HTML tables. It was definitely a big deal for a very long time. This book by David Siegel came out in 1996. It was one of the things that helped the whole industry decide or learn these techniques on how to do tables for layout type websites. And now it's a kind of great document to understand what we were thinking back then and what it was, the techniques that we were using. And in the beginning, in the introduction of this book, he has a kind of manifesto where he lays out why he thinks that these are good ideas and we should use them. And in that manifesto, he says, like the painters of Russia's avant-garde in the 1920s, we felt like pirates. I received flaming threats from people who said I didn't understand the web. I was ruining the information because I didn't understand the power of the medium. I fired back with more pages. I made it clear that we were not going to go away. If the Puritans wanted a fight, we would give it to them. We think that this fight somehow only started in the era of responsive design, but it didn't. It's been going on the entire time. In this book, he lays out this technique. Open up Photoshop, draw a picture of the ideal website that you want, use any means necessary, the most horrible code ever, that's fine, and out the other end you get a web page that kind of sort of looks like your Photoshop document. That technique is a technique we still use today. In this era, I think that we had some of the most creative and interesting designs that we've ever had on the web, actually. Part of that is because it was the 90s, and pixels were giant, and colors were bright, and it just kind of was part of the visual vocabulary of the internet. But also, I think it's because of this idea that we weren't worrying about the medium, we were just worrying about doing amazing, crazy, cool graphics. Desktop publishing was still new, many of us had just learned it, so here we were trying to apply those same kind of ideas about inventing the web and doing crazy things on the web. And for those of you who weren't there, what we were doing is taking a design, like this one, for example. There's going to be text on one side towards the top and text on the other side towards the bottom, and then these cards are going to flow into the space in between. But in order to do that, the only way to do that was to take that graphic of the cards and to chop it up into pieces and take all those little pieces and put them in separate table cells and just hope that your puzzle was going to reassemble itself properly. And here in this image from the book, you can see the table border cells are on, and there's space there. But what you would do using this technique is set all of those to 0, and they would disappear. They would become invisible, and all of those gaps would go away. So it would look like one big image, but really it was a whole bunch of jigsaw puzzle pieces. And we put more and more, increasingly more and more content into images and chopped those images up into smaller and smaller pieces. And it became really quite painful. It was also painful, especially at that time, because web standards, the documents that were written to define what HTML was going to be or define what other kind of web technologies were going to be, were very vague. They were very much like, hello, we have this idea, we think it should work something like this, but we're going to leave a lot of the detail out, and then each of you companies who are making browsers can decide for yourself how to take this big idea and turn it into something specific. But what that meant is that the team building Internet Explorer, the team building Mosaic, the team building Netscape would all have different ideas about what to do. They didn't coordinate on those ideas, and we ended up in a situation where websites did not work in two browsers at the same time if they had any level of complexity whatsoever. So frequently you would build a website just for Netscape, and you would build a second website if you had the budget just for Internet Explorer, and if you didn't have the budget, you had to choose which website to support. Crazy. It's not like that at all anymore today, despite the fact that people complain incessantly about Internet Explorer or go on and on about small differences between browsers or bugs, web compat bugs that do sometimes exist. The truth is, though, that process of creating web specs has changed so drastically that, for example, the CSS Grid specification, there's so much detail about every corner case, every obscure use case, every little thing that no one will ever want to do, exactly how browsers should implement that, so that it's implemented identically in all of the browsers, and you can come along and write code, and it will work the same in all of the browsers. Sometimes there's a mistake, sometimes there's a bug, sometimes there's something that's so obscure that it didn't get considered. But for the most part, the goal of the standards bodies, the CSS working group especially, is to make sure that the specs have all the detail necessary to get it exactly the same in every browser. That's a huge, huge difference. But back in the days of tables for layouts, that's not the reality that we had at all. So in order to try to solve that problem of not having the budget or not wanting to make a website work in different browsers, Flash became a tool that people turned to. I think as well because a lot of what was going on, it wasn't just print design, but also CD-ROM and interaction design. People were thinking still a lot about stuff like hypertext and what it meant to have a screen with buttons that you would click, and those would take you to someplace else. And Flash gave people the opportunity to take something that maybe they had created in Macromedia Director and replicate it in Flash, or take some of the interaction ideas about what it meant to have multimedia and put them onto the web. This was another big era. It kind of ran concurrently with tables for layout, but it was a way in which a lot of people built websites. And this was a very influential book. Flash Web Design by Hillman Curtis taught a lot of people, myself included, how to do these kinds of techniques. And in it, you can see the very first step that you needed to do to build a Flash website, a website where all the content was in Flash, is figure out, well, how big do you want your canvas to be, or we called it a movie. You would set this many pixels. I'm going to make this 600 pixels wide and 400 pixels tall. That's my movie. And the interaction model, or the model of what the thing was, is radically different than what we have today. You would have a timeline. Every object that was on the page was actually an object, and it would be moved around on the timeline. And the layout model for Flash was the same as the layout model for a lot of software on GUI computers at the time, which is this same layout model from MacDraw, which is you have an object, you grab it like a block of text or a circle or a line, and you just stick it where you want it, and it stays where you put it. Can you imagine? You actually just put it where you want it. It's the same interaction model as the real world. If you have some text and you want it to be centered at the top, you put it centered at the top. If it's crooked or if it's not centered, that's because the human didn't get it there. If you want it there, you just put it where you want it. And it was a way to, because we knew how big the canvas was, you could kind of very tightly control everything on the page. It also meant that everything being in a different layer, you would have things like a button where someone would click on the button and it would make something appear, and you would click on another button and it would make something else appear or disappear. Very, very different than what we do today. And then you would export this movie and put it inside an HTML page. The movie itself didn't talk to the HTML page at all or anything else on the web. There was really no way. It was this black box. You couldn't really communicate back and forth. If you wanted to have scrolling, you had to build your own scroll bars. If you wanted to update the content, you had to go back into that movie with the timeline and change the content. There were really quite a lot of things that just didn't work, including the fact that it had no idea how big the browser window was and wasn't going to adjust or change or reflow based on the space that was available. There was no way to do accessibility. There was no way to do SEO. It just, in some ways, turned out to be really not a good idea at all. And after years of pain, people decided, oh, maybe we should make websites out of web stuff. Maybe we should really use the web for what it is. And CSS came along. CSS being the place, the new styling code to be able to describe how everything looks. And this book, Jeffrey Zeldman, Designing with Web Standards, came out in 2003 and really helped introduce people, more and more people, to the idea of web standards, of being of the web itself. In this book, Jeffrey describes the difference between using table for layout code versus using semantic HTML. And he shows, hey, if you use these new techniques, these web standard-based techniques, you can have clean code that actually makes sense, where your sentences are full sentences. They're not embedded in some sort of puzzle piece image situation, where your code is readable and clean and reusable and semantic. And I remember reading this book and feeling like this is a real breath of fresh air, where if I have a picture of a dog, it's just a picture of a dog, and it's put on the page in clean code. That felt really refreshing. I think in some ways we have that problem now, where some of our code is so complicated and so complex, especially if everything's being done in JavaScript. In some ways, it's a lot like doing things in Flash. And a lot of us are having these kind of memories of the bad old days and realizing that some of the same mistakes we made we're starting to repeat. It's been long enough that we forgot the lessons that we learned. But there was something very refreshing about doing this. And there was also this sense that, hey, if you have an idea about an amazing graphic design that you want to do, and you can't do it using CSS, well, then just stop having that idea. Like, you're going to limit your ideas to what's possible. You're going to use what we have to make beautiful work. You're not going to worry about what else crazy ideas that you have, because the quality of the code is important. The ability to reuse code is very important. The ability for it to be accessible and findable and searchable and all that stuff is super important. So we're just going to have to stick with what we can. Semantic markup was a big lesson in this time, and this idea that we should really use semantic markup. Even though the web forgives us when we use all divs and spans, we really should use semantic markup. There's reasons to do that. There's also this idea of the separation of concerns, that HTML is what you should be using to deliver content and to create an interface, to create forms and buttons. That CSS is for the visual look and for the styling. And then, of course, JavaScript came along later to add an entire other layer of complexity and power, superpowers to the web. But this idea of those three things being separate is still a fundamental principle to the web today. But then the question is, well, how are you going to do layout in CSS, especially at the very beginning? Absolute positioning was the first idea. We're going to absolutely position everything. Now, this idea, in many ways, was basically taking this idea from layout, from GUIs, and saying, well, how did that box get to be where it is? Well, the Macintosh operating system is saying it's going to be 200 pixels from the top and 100 pixels from the left, and it's going to be 400 pixels wide and 300 pixels tall. And all of that math is how the layout got described in a lot of these programs like McDraw. So absolute positioning was kind of taking that model and putting it onto the web. The problem is that it doesn't really work. There was a talk given by Bert Boss and Halcom Lee, the two folks who wrote the original CSS1 specification at CSS Day in Amsterdam in 2017, and they were reminiscing about CSS and why they had made the decisions that they made. And somebody asked them in the Q&A, is there something that you put into CSS that you think was probably a mistake that maybe you shouldn't have done? And Halcom Lee very sheepishly answered, absolute positioning? Like, maybe we shouldn't have done it. There's nothing wrong with absolute positioning, of course. You should go back to work next week and use it. There's nothing toxic about it. The problem is that once you absolutely position something, you're taking it out of the flow. And so that benefit that you have of the content automatically scooting out of the way of other content and adjusting the layout on its own, you lose that benefit. So once you start positioning everything, then you're responsible for positioning everything. And you kind of have to know how big everything is. And the moment someone makes the font bigger, or the moment someone deletes a paragraph, or the moment something changes about the situation that that layout is being done in, there's nothing you can do, and things start crashing into each other, and it's a big giant mess. So this idea that we would use absolute positioning for everything turned out to not really be something that works. Of course, today what we use it for is absolutely positioning little things, like a little banner that says new, and you want it to be on the top of a photo or something. It works great in those situations. It just didn't work for all of the page. So I put it on the timeline here as this little blip, this little hope of a dream that died very quickly. Instead, what we did is we figured out how to do float-based layouts using a hack. Floats, of course, there's absolutely nothing wrong with floats. We should be using floats long into the future. This is what they were invented to do. You float the photo, and the flow content will flow around the photo. That's pretty cool. We should do that now. But we shouldn't use it to lay out the entire page. We had to, though, back in the day, because it's the only thing we had. So we take this example, we're going to take the first two elements and wrap them in a container, and take the rest of the content, wrap them into another container. You're going to take that first container and give it a width, maybe of a percent, like 45%, and float it left. Take the other container, give it a width of 45%, float it right. Hope that those two 45% don't come anywhere near 100%, because there were all these bugs back in the day, and you just end up with fluid columns and a layout, which is something that we still, at least until last year, until the year before last, we relied on very, very heavily. It's the heart of responsive web design to have fluid columns. The problem with doing an entire layout with fluid web design is seen in this diagram, where we've got this image. The image is the intrinsic size that it is. It just is the size that it came out of Fireworks or whatever program it was created in. And you can very easily end up in a situation where the image starts to overflow and sticks and overlaps and looks like it's broken, the layout. So you need to keep the image really small, say for a 640 pixel wide screen, because you're sort of going to assume that everybody has at least 640 pixels. But then as soon as people have bigger monitors, and you've got this kind of awkward white space on the right of the photo, and the line length of that line of text is starting to get far too long. So a lot of people were advocating very hard that fluid web design was the core essence of the web, and that's how we should be doing it. But there were a lot of other people who were saying, and I was one of these people, it's ugly. I want something more pretty. I don't care necessarily completely about the essence of the core of the spirit of the web. I want it to be pretty. So we tried it for a while. A lot of people tried it for a long time, but also a lot of people were just kind of like, no, I want my pretty website. So along came fixed width layouts using floats. Very, very similar, but instead of putting percent widths on the columns, you just put fixed pixels on the column. You make this column be 550 pixels wide, you make this column be 300 pixels wide. That adds up to 850 plus whatever for the gap. And okay, that's going to fit on most screens, I hope, fingers crossed. And then when it doesn't fit, then basically all the content overflows, which doesn't look nearly as broken. It looks like your browser's just too small for that content. And you could then kind of magically make your images be the width that you knew, because you would know how wide that column was going to be. You kind of make things, you could control things better. So this, of course, was the way that we did it for a very long time as well. Fixed size content, I think, is a lesson from this era that we have set aside over the last 8 years, but it actually is a really good lesson to bring back up again, that there are reasons and there are moments when having content be a fixed size is actually a really good idea. Maybe you do want a photo to just be the size that it is. It doesn't need to grow and shrink. Maybe you have some kind of headline that's just going to be the size that it wants to be, and you don't want to have it wrap all the time. And in the new world that we have, you can actually do a lot with fixed size content. So I think it's time to kind of think about, what did we do back then that was a good idea? So here on my timeline, you can see fluid and fixed. They competed with each other for a long time. Lots of blog posts were written about which one was better. And then, of course, responsive web design came along. In 2010, Ethan Marcotte coined the term responsive web design and defined it as a flexible grid, flexible images, and media queries. And pretty much everybody who was a big fan of fluid web design said, absolutely, we're switching to responsive, told you so, I knew it the whole time, fluid is better. Fixed width people, of course, dragged their heels for quite a while. Some switched quickly, some didn't. A lot of folks said, no, let's have fixed width columns, but we'll change the number of them at different breakpoints, which kind of got labeled adaptive for a little while. So of course this has been a big debate, but for the most part, responsive has taken over as the way to do web page layouts. And if we take this same example, we can see by putting a width of 100% on the image itself can shrink and grow in order to fit nicely into that column. We can control sort of line lengths on text by doing better graphic design. And then, of course, once things get to be too narrow or too wide, we can use media queries, set a breakpoint, and change the design. The two big things that were new in this era that are lessons that are important to what we do today, this idea of making images be fluid, images, video, other kinds of media, that was pretty sacrilegious, because for a long time we always felt like you really need to make your image be the size that it needs to be. If you want a 300 pixel wide image, you make it be a 300 pixel wide image. Why would you take a 600 pixel wide image and squish it down to 300 pixels? That's wasting a lot of kilobytes. It's going to be hard, especially on a modem. In this era, we said, hey, actually, there is some complexity and there are reasons to worry about performance. We've got to think through that. But for the most part, we actually can resize our images in CSS. Let's start doing that. There's a good idea here. And media queries. Media queries were invented by the CSS Working Group and were shipped into browsers in 2009. Responsive web design really explained to us what we could do with them and how we could change our layout and adjust and adapt depending on the size of the viewport. And Ethan said in his talk, when he first started talking about responsive web design, that for him it was never only about layout. It was also about so much more. And over the course of the last 8 years, there's been one conference talk after another, after another, after another, where we've talked about a lot of things that are very important around business strategy, around how do you understand performance? What does it mean to be using a mobile phone? What does it mean to be able to fit your content into the space that's available? How do we handle organizing our CMS, that all the content goes in and then gets delivered back out to multiple platforms? These conversations are super important, and they've all been happening under this umbrella of responsive web design. And I say yes to all of that. Of course, those are important landmarks in the evolution of web design. I think all of those things are still completely true and are key to the future. I don't know that they have to necessarily fall under the umbrella of responsive web design. I feel like it's just how every website should be made. Welcome to 2018. But let's talk about layout. Let's talk about all of these CSS properties that have come along and what it means for graphic design on the web, especially these four. These are the four major models, the four major layout contexts that we have that we can be using. And we're going to be using them together. We're going to be combining them all at the same time. I think sometimes people think, should I be using this one or that one? The answer is yes, you're going to be using all of them. So for example, we might have Flexbox. We have this card, some kind of like teaser card, and we want to go ahead and like lay that out using Flexbox, because there's going to be a whole bunch of them. The content's going to be different on each one of them, and Flexbox is going to give us a way to do a layout, program it once, and have all these interesting things happen. But then the cards themselves, perhaps we're going to lay those cards out by using Grid. We're going to make the container for those cards be a Grid container and lay them out using Grid. And then over here, we've got something in the side, like this little sidebar-y thing, and we want to have some other little smaller things underneath, and those little smaller things, when there's space, we'd like them to be in columns, and when there's not so many space, we want there to be fewer columns. And really, that might be best laid out by using multicolumn. So we're going to wrap that in a container, and we're going to use multicolumn for that particular context. And those two things together, that image and those little bitty things underneath it, those are going to need to be laid out together. Well, but we don't actually have to do anything. It's fine for those to just work in a flow layout. We don't have to write code for that. We'll just let that be a flow layout. But then the whole thing, both of those groups together, like, oh, we could use Grid for that part. Up in the corner, we've got some navigation. Well, it's going to do very beautifully by using Flexbox. So we'll use that as a Flexbox container. And then the whole thing itself is a flow layout. So this is the new reality that we have, where we're going to be combining all of these different things together. So CSS Grid, of course, is the star of that show. There's a whole toolkit, but CSS Grid, in some ways, the fact that CSS Grid came out is what's really the moment that's changing everything. And for the first year, as I was learning CSS Grid, I was thinking about it as responsive design, now more better. I'm going to be coming up with designs the same way I did during the responsive era. I'm going to be writing different code by using Grid. That will be cool, but in some ways, it's not that different for, say, the experience of users or the experience of design. But I actually have come to instead believe that this is a major moment in this timeline, where this change from responsive to the future is as significant as the change from tables for layout to CSS, or from fixed width layouts to responsive. And I think that in part because this dynamic, this fight between whether we should honor the kind of graphic design that we want or whether we should honor web and the quality of the code, has changed. The dynamic between those two impulses has changed. Under the era of responsive web design, it's really been, it's the web. If this idea you have can't be done, then you just shouldn't want that idea. I think that's changed completely. I think actually now the challenge will be to think of the ideas that we stopped thinking of for a long time and start to really figure out what it is that we want graphic design-wise. So I think we need to name this era. I'd like to kind of mark it and give it a name. Whether we use the name or not, I don't know, but I'm proposing that we call it Intrinsic Web Design. And intrinsic, I mean belonging to the essential nature or the constitution of a thing. That it's intrinsic to the web itself, that we finally, in 2017, 2018, 2019, have a layout system for the web, where we can use something of the web, by the web, for the web, intrinsic to the web, to do graphic design, to do web design. It's also a word that's floating around because it's the name of the CSS intrinsic and extrinsic sizing module. And part of understanding the new system of layout is understanding sizing and understanding intrinsic sizing and extrinsic sizing and which one you want to use. Although I don't necessarily mean it specifically the way that it's used in this particular CSS module. So I'm going to talk today about the new reality of intrinsic web design and how I see this code, this change in the technology, how it is that it changes what's possible with design. And I want to talk specifically about three things. I want to talk about contracting and expanding space. I want to talk about flexibility and about the viewport itself. So first, ways to contract and expand space. Really, in some ways, the challenge of doing a layout on a big screen and a small screen both at the same time is figuring out, what do I do when there's not very much space? And what do I do when there's a whole lot of space? And how can I make my layout contract or expand based on the situation that I'm in? What we've had so far are two different ways to think about this. One of them is wrap and reflow. So for example, this text, it's reflowing. It's wrapping and reflowing. When there's not as much space, it gets narrower, it just reflows, it wraps. Or you can also think about it with things like images. They are, to the point of view of the design, wrapping, they're reflowing. Or these cards, this idea that you have fewer and fewer of them in a row, more and more of them in a row. It's a way to kind of wrap and reflow content in order to make it contract and expand. We also have the ability to enlarge and shrink. So we do this a lot with images. Make something shrink when there's not so much space, make it grow when there's more space. We can also do this with sizing type. For example, this is set in Viewport width units. So this phrase of text is shrinking when there's less space, it's growing when there's more space. There's all kinds of ways people have done responsive typography. But at most rudimentary, the idea is that, oh yeah, the text can kind of get smaller. I think with variable fonts, which are coming soon, there's an even more interesting way to do this, which is that the text could not get smaller or bigger. It could stay the same size, but it could get skinnier, or it could get wider, it could get lighter, it could get bolder in order to contract and expand space. Mostly what we've been doing, especially in the responsive era, is combining these things. So the images are shrinking and growing while the text is wrapping, the cards themselves are shrinking and growing, and the cards are wrapping. You combine them and you get responsive web design. But there are two other ways now that we have, two other powers to think about layout and to think about how to use up space or to take up space. One of them is to add or remove white space. You could keep your content the same size and add more space around it, more white space around it. And I've been mentioning this quite a lot over the last year, and I've been getting some pushback from folks, especially folks who are sort of famous in the graphic design conversation about web design, and they've kind of said, well, we've always had white space. What are you talking about? There's nothing new here. And what I think they mean is that we've always had the ability to add padding and margins and kind of push things away from each other or to leave gaps that are bigger or smaller. But really, we have an entirely new way to handle white space that's much more powerful than, say, padding, where we can use vertical centering to along with, we've always had horizontal centering, but now we also, with Flexbox, with alignment, with grid, with alignment, we've got true vertical centering. We can measure the height of the viewport. We can set something up with viewport height units and create white space in the vertical dimension in a way that was never possible before. We also can use CSS Grid to place items on a grid and to create rows and create white space by using rows. You can create a row and leave that row completely empty if you want, and create beautiful white space that's intentional, white space that isn't just kind of like ugly leftover space because that photo was too small, but is actually something that was done deliberately. This is an example that I made recently where I took graphic design from the early 20th century and made it morph into this, change based on the amount of space that's available. Some of this, of course, is the content shrinking and growing, but quite a bit of this is actually controlling deliberate white space and changing the deliberate white space at different points. The other thing that we can do that we've never really been able to do before is to overlap things, to slide things behind each other. Instead of just getting smaller or bigger or moving out of each other's way, we can let items overlap each other, which is something that's done quite a lot in magazine design, but we've not been doing in web design. And this is one of the biggest differences between tables for layout and CSS Grid. Sometimes I'll see blog posts that are written that kind of say, oh yeah, CSS Grid, we already been there, done that. It's the same thing as tables for layout. But the thing with tables for layout is you couldn't have more than one item in any given cell. And so we ended up with all those puzzle pieces, and we ended up with these situations where you just couldn't overlap things. CSS Grid, you can. CSS Grid, you can put things across different cells, and you can overlap them. You can let them slide behind each other. We also have translucency and filters and blend modes and such, and that will allow us to do some really beautiful things that it's just completely different than tables for layout. It's really not the same at all. So here's an example, very simple, but you can see where the items aren't really getting smaller. They are, in fact, overlapping more with each other or less with each other. Or here's a teaser card where it's fairly simple. The content's not shrinking in this one, but it's just overlapping or not overlapping. So these are ways to contract and expand the space. 4 options now, instead of just 2. I have a channel up on YouTube called Layout Land, and I've got videos, one about overlap and one about white space, where I can walk you through the code for these examples and show you even more examples, show you exactly how it's done if you want to dig deeper. 2, new possibilities for flexibility. So in the realm of shrinking and expanding by changing size, we actually have quite a lot of other possibilities now for flexibility. Let's look first at images. So fixed images, right? We've had this forever. Images are just the size that they are. Nothing really special about them. Fluid images, what we've been doing a lot of in the era of responsive web design is putting a width on them in percents, like 100% width or 50% width. And that makes the image get smaller when there's less space and bigger when there's more space. It also means that the height automatically changes along with the width of the image. What we've not been doing, we could have kind of, except in the world of floats, it really didn't do much, and so we never did. But now with grid, actually, we have a lot of ability to control things in the vertical dimension, to control rows. So I think there's actually a lot of reasons now that we might want to do this, which is instead of applying a width of 100%, for example, put a height of 100%. In which case, the image is going to shrink and grow in the vertical dimension based on what's going on vertically, and then it's not going to do anything necessarily in the horizontal direction. Kind of interesting. I think what's even more interesting is the ability to set both the height and the width at the same time. This is something that we've not been doing on the web, because if you do this in CSS around, I don't know, 2015, you're just going to end up with a smushed person, and smushed person photos are very undesirable. You really don't want to break the aspect ratio of your image. But now we have this new property in CSS called object fit, or specifically object fit cover, which will allow you to set both the height and the width of an image at the same time, a content image that's in the HTML, that's in the content, and have it get cropped by the browser. Doesn't work in all use cases. There's plenty of times when you wouldn't want this to happen, but it is an option, and I think it's a beautiful option that can actually work very well in a lot of situations. Or maybe you do want your graphic design to control something in the vertical direction, and your images are going to be handled by using Object Fit Cover. I have a video about this, about Object Fit on Layout Land. So really now we have 4 options for sizing our photos, when over the last 8 years we've only had 1. So we went from 1 to 4. We can start using fixed size images again because of CSS Grid. So let's think about columns. Columns are a big deal in responsive web design. They're fluid. One of the things that we haven't really noticed about the water we've been swimming in is that all of those columns shrink and grow at the same rate in the world of responsive web design. If we put 33% or 30% on each of these boxes, they're going to shrink and grow at the same time at the same rate. It is because we're putting percents on things, and percents are just simply calculated on the width of the containing block. If you have a 1,000 pixel wide thing and you've told something inside of it to be 40%, it's going to be 400 pixels. We think of it as fluid because from the perspective of a web developer, it is fluid, but from the perspective of the browser, that's not really a dynamic number. It's a number that the browser calculates, and then it knows, well, that's 400 pixels. It's a set length. Now, though, we have more options for defining columns. Instead of only having percents, we can define them using fixed numbers, min content or max content, FR units, min, max, and auto. It makes it very complicated, and it makes it very powerful. So let's talk first about, I want to point out something about FR units that are quite different than how percents work. In order to explain that, I need to make sure you understand what min content sizing is. So let me explain that. So if I have a sentence and I've got it in a containing block and I put a fixed length on that containing block, like 400 pixels, the content's going to wrap, the text is going to wrap inside of that container. If instead I put width, or I set up some sort of situation where the width is being defined as max content, then that phrase of text is going to be the longest that it could possibly be and no longer. It's going to be the words plus that period, and that's it. That's the max content length of that string of text. If I instead say, oh, I want that to be min content width, then it will be as narrow as it can possibly be without any overflow. So as small as it can be without anything that looks broken. And in this case, with text, it's the length of the longest word, the word sentence here. One of the things about using a percent is that if you have some words and you've got, or an image, and you've got a containing block, and you say that that containing block should be, say, 25%, and it's in a 400 pixel wide container, then it's going to be 100 pixels. But if the min content length of that text is 150 pixels, then it's overflowing. You end up with overflow, and there's sort of no way to handle it because you've told it to be 25%, so it's calculating down to a fixed length in pixels. And we end up with this situation, right? Which makes for some cool merch, but this is what people hate about CSS. This problem with trying to control things, but you really can't control them with overflow. Well, the best thing about FR units, one of the best things about FR units, is that by default, FR units never shrink down past min content size. They'll be flexible, they'll grow and shrink, but they're smart. So when they get to the min content size of whatever is inside of them, they'll just be like, whoa, we're going to stop right here. We're going to stay min content size. We're not going to create overflow because overflow is ugly, and we don't want any more mugs. So here's an example. We've got 4 columns here. They're each set to be 1 FR wide, and you can see that they're growing. They act like 4% based widths. But as we get smaller and smaller and smaller, you'll see that they shrink all the way down. Now, the longest word in that paragraph is the second word in Latin that I can't pronounce. And you can see as soon as it hits that min content size, and it's hitting it for all 4 at the same time because they all have the same content, they stop, and then the group of them overflows together, and it doesn't get any smaller. You could think of FR units as a min-max statement where the minimum is min content and the maximum is 1 FR. And 1 FR, basically it's saying, hey, if you've got a bunch of extra space, then I want you to take that extra space and I want you to distribute it among all of the other FR units. So if you've got 4 1 FR units, 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1 is 4, so that means you get 1/4, you get 1/4, you get 1/4, you get 1/4, and the browser will do all the math for you. But the minimum it's going to be is min content. If you don't like that, and there are people who don't, and there are certain use cases that maybe where that's not what you want, you could instead write min-max 0 to 1FR to force the browser to go ahead and make things go smaller than the min content size. The power is there, you just have to write the code slightly different. So here in this example, I've got 4 columns, 1FR, 2FR, 4FR, and 6FR. And what you'll see is the 1FR unit column is already down to min content size. So it stopped shrinking. And now the 2FR unit column is min content. The 4FR column is about to get there. The 6FR column still has a little ways to go. And what you'll also notice is that the rate at which these are shrinking is not a straight line. There's kind of a logarithmic effect happening where because it's going to stop at min content, the browser sort of adjusting everything accordingly. And you can see here that the 6FR column is growing and shrinking much more quickly than, say, the 2FR column. It's very interesting and quite different than how things behave using percents. Here, I've got 3 of the columns marked with 1FR, and then that bigger column has a min-max size applied to it. Min-max 250 to 600 pixels. The other thing that's happening is that the FR units get the extra available space, but the min-max statement is handled first. So min-max goes to max, it gets to 600 pixels and it stops there, and then the FR units get all the space. And going the other direction, the FR units all shrink while the min-max column is staying at max, and then the min-max column starts to squish down after the FR units have hit min content size. So there's actually 2 stages of flexibility. Some of these columns are growing and shrinking while others stay the same, and then that one starts to grow and shrink while the first ones stay the same. Very interesting to me. When I stumbled across this by just making demos, I didn't understand this. I was just writing code, throwing it at the wall, and I was like, what is going on? Why are there 2 stages of flexibility? It's the nature of intrinsic web design. Here I've got 200 pixels in that first column, so it's just going to stay the same size the whole time. The 1FRs are getting rid of their flexibility first, or their extra space. They're getting rid of the extra space as we have less and less space until they hit the min content size, and then that starts to apply pressure to the min-max, making the min-max smaller and smaller and smaller, and the opposite in reverse. Or here, just to make things a little more complicated, let me see if I can really break your brain. I threw auto in there. Auto is this magical, I don't know, it's just maybe what you think it might be, and maybe it's weird. In this case, auto is trying to be max content. So auto's just hogging up all the extra space. It's like, I get all the space, and the FR units get nothing. So all the FR unit columns are just at their min content size, being like, auto took all the space. There's no extra space. I have to be min content. And auto's like, please give me more space. If we stretch it out far enough, when auto hit its max content size, which would be that entire paragraph on one line, then it would stop growing, and there would be space for the FR units. Min-max is doing the same thing that it was doing before. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. There's all sorts of possibilities with these different units that you can throw into a grid formatting context. There's all kinds of territory for us to explore and ideas to try out. There's really no reason for me to stand up here and try to articulate everything because it's just too much. What we need to do is to get into browsers and to think about what's possible and to play and play and play until you find something that is interesting and doing what it is that you want it to do. The other thing is that everything I just described about columns is also completely true about rows, which has never been true in the history of the web. There's nothing about floats that work in the row direction. But grid is basically the same in the column and the row direction. So the example I'm about to show you, in the column direction, I've defined the center column to be min-max to go from 0 to 40 characters. Yes, CH is a unit, 40 character units. And then 2FR tracks. And the row direction, those gray boxes, the black box and the gray box are going to have text in them, and I've set them to be auto height. So they're going to be whatever height they need to be to hold the text and no more. The top row is 20% of the total, and the others are 2FR and 1FR. And then I've applied like a VH unit to the whole thing, or something. I've applied something to the whole thing to make it taller than it would be if everything were simply auto. And this is the result. So I've got a component here that has no media queries in it at all. And it's not dependent on things that, I mean, you could drop this component into anything and it will resize in order to fit into its containing block. And because there's no media queries, it means that we don't need the magical unicorn container queries that do not exist and may or may not ever exist. There are ways to work around this desire for container queries by using and really deeply understanding CSS Grid and everything that's part of Intrinsic Web Design. I have a 3-part series on layout land where I talk about min content and max content. I talk about FR units, and I talk about min-max. I show a completely different set of examples and explain it all in detail exactly how it works if you want to learn more. So that's the new possibilities for flexibility. And really what I think this means is that we are programming a flexibility model when we're coding up a layout. We're not being prescriptive and saying, I want you to be here, and I want you to be 17 units to the left. We're sort of programming this model of artificial intelligence around how we want the browser to calculate the layout. And it's a level of abstraction that is even more complicated than what we're used to. If we were to go out and sit on the dock at over the lake with an oil painting, making an oil painting, and you wanted to make green to be the green to represent the trees, and you were going to sit there and paint the oil painting. You could just mix the green that you wanted and paint it on the oil painting and hang that on the wall, and people would walk by and see the shade of green that you intended. It's very direct. You get what you actually see. You get what you actually intended. With print design, and I think we misunderstand this at times, with print design there's one level of abstraction. I think frequently students who make PDFs and are practicing for print design, and they feel like, ooh, look at me, I know how to make books and merch and postcards and posters, because look, this beautiful PDF I made, you could hire me today and I could go to the printing press and everything would be perfect. They're going to learn a really hard lesson if they start actually doing print design when they drive to the printer and pick up their first print job and realize that that gorgeous photo that looks so amazing on the monitor is totally muddy and looks horrible on the real postcard. I've learned that lesson many, many times over 20 years of print design. There's an abstraction. You start to learn, oh, I need to make the photo look extra light or extra red or extra whatever on my computer monitor in order for it to come out the way I want it to on the piece of paper. Or, oh, I'm choosing an off-white uncoded stock, so I should adjust my color spectrum about this amount. This is why you have print proofs, if you can afford them. This is why there's like a proofing process, because there's this abstraction where what you see on the screen is not what you actually get out of the printing press. It's slightly different. There's another level of abstraction on the web, and we've talked about this a lot, but we also fight about this a lot, where what you write in CSS, what we say in CSS, may or may not actually get used by the browser. A person might click reader mode, and all the colors and all the fonts that you so carefully chose are just going to go away, and they're going to see it the way that they set up reader mode to work. Or maybe there's a network connection problem, a really slow connection, or the CDN didn't get the bill paid, and so something about your CSS didn't load, or your web font didn't load, and so people don't actually get what your CEO signed off on. They get something that's slightly different. This is part of the art of web design, and part of the art of being a good front-end developer is being able to create some kind of code that's resilient and handles what's going on with different users, different browsers, different network connections, where you're never really quite sure what people are going to see. You just hope it's close to what you intended, and it's okay if it's not. There's another level where the CSS is just some suggestions. But I think this way of thinking about programming a flexibility model is actually another abstraction up, where you're actually not even trying to be prescriptive about exactly how the layout is going to work, where you're creating a real artificial intelligence algorithm to handle the layout. Programming the flexibility model. This also opens up this question of should web designers code, right? Like this, oh my God, what a nightmare, let's talk about this again. And whatever you think is the right answer to that question, I think if we get away from the job titles and the who does what and who's allowed to do what, I think pretty much every project kind of goes through the same arc, where somewhere something gets born as an idea, and then there's some sort of lower fidelity process. Maybe it involves paper and pen, maybe it involves wireframes, and things kind of get higher fidelity, and maybe people put a lot of time and effort into high fidelity drawings, and maybe they kind of don't, and they sort of skip over this. But at some point, it goes into code in a browser. The reality, I think, especially in the era of intrinsic web design, is that there's still design happening in the coding stage. That the front-end developer, even if you don't want it to be the case, your front-end developer is finishing your designs. And so we need to acknowledge that. There's a way in which this kind of complexity around whether you should use min-max or whether you should use FR units can really only be figured out in code. Web design is actually finished in the browser. And programming a flexibility model, I think, can only be finished in the browser. We're designing in the browser, which is why I've been really honored over the last 2 years to be able to spend my life articulating the vision for and leading the design of these 3 tools in Firefox to make it easier to design in the browser and to give you things that you need. The Firefox Grid Inspector lets you visualize the grids that you are making to make it easier to understand what's happening. The Firefox Shape Path Editor lets you directly edit by dragging points when you're using CSS shapes or clip path. And the Firefox Font Editor, which is shipping October 23rd, 2018, is going to let you see what kind of variable axes are available or not available for any specific font, and hopefully, fingers crossed, eventually also reveal any sort of open type features and let you more easily adjust your typography very quickly by using sliders. These things and others are things that we need to be able to actually go ahead and design in the browser. So let's talk about the third major thing I want to talk about today, which is viewports, and how I think intrinsic web design changes how we use the viewport and how we understand the viewport. The viewport, of course, is that browser window, that thing that people use to view our websites. In the era of Fluid, the content would just kind of end up on the page, right? And it would respond, it would react to the top edge of the page, and it would react to the left and the right edges of the page. It would start in our writing mode in the upper left-hand corner, and it would flow as the right edge of the browser changed, the Fluid design would change. Maybe not the images, but the rest of it would kind of change, like this. In the fixed width era, really, we were asking the browser to pay attention to the top edge and to the left edge and to ignore the right edge. Just don't worry about that right edge. I don't know what that is. We can just pretend that it's not. It never changes, that it's always magically 1024. And that's kind of, so we end up with Fluid paid attention to 3 sides, fixed paid attention to 2 sides, and responsive got us to go back and pay attention to 3 sides again. But we still would go to these meetings and try to convince people that there is no fold, there's no bottom edge, there's no fourth edge, we can't control anything having to do with that fourth edge. And in the era of floats, when floats were our only tool, that was true. There really wasn't anything that we could do to react to get our layouts to react to that fourth edge. But the reality is that in intrinsic web design, we can. We have a lot of tools now to be able to create a design that reacts to the fourth edge. One of them is vertical centering. You can use vertical centering using the alignment properties in either Flexbox or in Grid, and you can get things to react, to align to the bottom edge or to center vertically. We also have vertical viewport units. Both of these things we've had for a little while, but we haven't really been using them to adjust layouts to the fourth edge, because I don't think we've been creative enough yet about the way that CSS has changed what's possible. And then the big thing, the thing that's definitely changing what we can do, is CSS Grid and the ability to create rows in CSS Grid. So here's one example of a design that is responding to the fourth edge, that's reacting to all 4 edges of the page. And this is not just simply using vertical media queries. This is not something that we could do in 2010. This is really a different way in which we can use all 4 edges of the viewport to help us do better graphic design. Overflow, of course, is important. There's going to be overflow. We have to figure out what to do with overflow. But especially when there's extra space, when there's white space, we can program that white space to be really beautiful and to create kind of moments in a layout where things look great inside that viewport. I accomplished this by using CSS Grid. I have no columns in this, but I have these rows. So the 2 rows with text are both sized to be auto, and they are the height they need to be for the text that's inside of them, along with some margins on that text. The house is in a min-max statement that never gets shorter than 100 pixels and never gets taller than 350 pixels. And then all the extra space, if there is any extra space, 3 units of it goes above and 1 unit of it goes below. And so what's going to happen? If there's less and less space, the FR units are going to go down to 0, and then the min-max is going to start squishing until it hits 100, and then you're going to overflow, and it's not going to get any smaller than that. I explain how that the example works in even more detail in a video. Also, I have 2 other videos about designing for viewports and what I think this means and how we can use it graphic design-wise. I think this really does change how we use a viewport, that we are programming to all 4 edges of that viewport. Intrinsic web design. It changes the dynamics of this fight. It means that we don't actually have to choose between great design, great graphic design, and semantic, clean, reusable components and reusable code. We can have both. We can actually just play in the sandbox and make some really amazing graphic design, pull ideas out of the 90s, back when we didn't care about the quality of code, or pull ideas from film or from any place outside of the web to trigger our creativity and get us thinking. I was on Jeffrey Zeldman's podcast, The Big Web Show, episode number 176, talking about intrinsic web design, and I was on Shop Talk Show number 328, also talking about intrinsic web design, if you're interested in hearing me ramble more about what I think of all these things. Layout Land has a whole bunch of videos. I think I'm up to 40 or 50 at this point. You can subscribe. You can also subscribe by email if you want to do that instead of signing up for Google. I have a website called labs.jensimmons.com where I have tons of examples from the last 4 years exploring what's possible, figuring out how to do things. Many of them have CodePen repos as well, and you can click over and go into CodePen and fork it and mess around with it. All of the examples from today are up at labs.jensimmons.com with CodePen links as well. I just really think that this is an amazing time. It's a massive change to how we can do layout and graphic design on the web, and I want us to grab it and do something amazing and not simply create responsive web design, now more better, but change graphic design, change the medium of what we do, and create better experiences for our audiences. Thanks.